The morning Marcus Hale turned 53, no one knew it was his birthday. There was no cake, no phone call, no one waiting by the door with coffee and a warm smile the way his mother used to, back when the world was a kinder place and he was a boy who believed things got better if you were patient enough. There was just the cold. That particular Tuesday in late November arrived the way all mornings did for Marcus, with the slow, grinding intrusion of reality. The shelter on Birchwood Avenue woke its residents at 5:45 with a buzzer that sounded less like an alarm and more like an accusation. He'd learned not to flinch at it anymore. He'd learned not to feel a lot of things anymore. That, he had long since decided, was simply the cost of surviving. He folded his blanket with the same careful precision he'd used when he was an architect. He smoothed the edges. He tucked the corners. Old habits, old ghosts. Marcus had once designed buildings, not the glass and steel towers that corporate firms pushed out like photocopies, but real buildings, schools in underserved counties, a community arts center in rural Pennsylvania, a small library in West Virginia that won a regional design award in 2003. He still had the photograph of that library somewhere in the storage unit he could no longer afford. He still remembered the day the doors opened, the way the children came inside and looked up at the skylights he designed to flood the reading room with afternoon light. He didn't think about those things anymore, or rather, he tried not to. The shelter's common room smelled of institutional coffee and damp coats. Marcus took his place near the end of the breakfast line with the same quiet dignity he carried everywhere, shoulders back, eyes forward, the posture of a man who refuses to shrink, even when the world has done everything in its power to make him feel small. "Hey, Hale," a younger man named Desi bumped his shoulder, grinning with the easy energy of someone who still believed luck could turn. "You hear they're shutting down the work crew program? The city cut the funding." "I heard. That was your only gig coming up, right?" Marcus didn't answer. He took his tray.
The eggs were the color of old paper. He ate them anyway, because his body didn't care about aesthetics anymore. His body just wanted fuel. Around him, conversations rose and fell. About the weather turning. About a man named Gerald who'd gotten into a fight at the third-floor dorms. About which churches in the area were serving hot meals on Wednesday. The ordinary commerce of people trying to make it through a day. He was halfway through his coffee when the social worker, a kind-faced woman named Denise, appeared at his elbow. "Marcus, good. I was hoping to catch you before the morning rush." She sat across from him, tucking her lanyard to the side. She had eyes that had seen everything this city could produce and had not yet stopped caring, which he found quietly remarkable. "How's the knee?" "It works." "The doctor said—" "It works," he said again. Gently. "I'm fine, Denise." She folded her hands on the table. He knew what she was about to say before she said it. I could see it in the way she paused, the way people always paused before delivering news they'd rehearsed. "Your time here is up at the end of the month. I've been trying to find extensions, but the shelter's at capacity through the winter. There's a program in Springfield." "And not going to Springfield." "Marcus."
"My daughter is here. She's 30 miles away." He said it quietly, without anger, without the bitterness that might have been forgivable given the circumstances. He just said it the way you state a fact that has become the architecture of your entire existence. "I'm not going to Springfield." Denise looked at him for a long moment. She didn't push. She knew enough to know when a wall had been built from love, not stubbornness. What she didn't know, what Marcus himself had not yet told anyone in that building, was that his daughter, Claire, hadn't spoken to him in 4 years, that the 30 miles between them might as well have been an ocean, that his reasons for staying were less about the present and more about the hope of a future he couldn't fully visualize but couldn't bring himself to abandon. He left the shelter at 7:15 with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the cold greeting him like an old enemy that no longer even needed to introduce itself. The city moved around him the way cities do, purposeful, indifferent, layered with the sounds and smells of 10,000 lives running on parallel tracks. He walked 3 blocks to the corner of 5th and Merchant, where he'd been picking up day labor work whenever the construction company needed extra hands. Today, he arrived at the same time as 8 other men, most of them younger, all of them waiting in the half-dark under the amber glow of a streetlight. The foreman, a stocky man named Brent, came out at 7:30 and looked at the group with the appraising eye of someone who has reduced human beings to units of productivity. "I need 4, Brent said.
He started pointing. You. His eyes slid past Marcus entirely, then past him again on the return. You. The fourth man. Wasn't Marcus.
No explanation, no acknowledgement. Just the foreman turning back toward the site entrance and 4 men following him in, and 6 men remaining on the sidewalk with nothing to show for having woken before dawn in the cold. The other men dispersed quickly, muttering. Marcus stood there a moment longer. There was a boy across the street, maybe 12 years old, waiting for a school bus. He was watching Marcus. Not cruelly, just the unfiltered observation of a child who hasn't yet learned that looking too directly at certain kinds of suffering is considered rude. Their eyes met. The boy looked away first. Marcus adjusted the strap of his canvas bag and started walking. He had nowhere specific to go. He had learned to be excellent at having nowhere to go. He walked the way water finds its level, through the path of least resistance, drifting south through the commercial district, past the coffee shops exhaling warmth onto the sidewalk, past the law offices and the insurance brokers and the boutique with the perfect coats in the window. He did not stop to look in the window. He had broken himself of that particular habit 2 winters ago. Wanting things you cannot have is a tax the mind cannot afford to keep paying. It was on the corner of Delancey Street, just before 11 o'clock in the morning, that a man in a gray suit and a coat that cost more than Marcus had earned in the last 3 months stopped him. Marcus Hale. He stopped, turned. Yes.
The man had the professional caution of someone accustomed to delivering news in legally precise ways. He reached into a leather briefcase and produced a card that he held with both hands, as though it were fragile. Perkins and Aldrich, attorneys at law. My name is Robert Aldrich. I've been looking for you for 6 weeks. Name in over 30 years. I didn't know Lawrence was still alive, he said. He wasn't, as of October 14th. Aldrich's voice was measured, professional, practiced at the difficult business of delivering complicated information to people who weren't ready to receive it. Mr. Hale, in his will, your uncle has left you his entire estate. Marcus looked up from the card. What estate? The lawyer cleared his throat. He glanced at the street around them, the cold sidewalk, the canvas bag, the worn coat, and something moved briefly behind his professional composure. Something that might have been pity, or something more complex than pity. That, he said carefully, is what makes this somewhat unusual.
The law office of Perkins and Aldrich occupied the 4th floor of a building on Camden Street that smelled of mahogany and old paper, the kind of place where the furniture had been chosen to communicate permanence. Marcus sat across from Robert Aldrich's desk, feeling, as he so often felt in rooms like this, like a man in the wrong scene of someone else's movie. There was coffee, real coffee, not the gray institutional kind. He held the cup in both hands and let the warmth travel up his arms. Aldrich laid documents on the desk one at a time, with the deliberateness of a man who has learned that timing matters in these conversations. Your Uncle Lawrence was your father's younger brother. He moved out of state in 1987. He lived a somewhat solitary life. He was the one who left, Marcus said. My father never talked about him. I think there was a falling out. There was, Aldrich paused. We found documentation of it. I won't go into the details unless you want me to, but the short version is that Lawrence left the family under difficult circumstances and spent the next several decades rebuilding what you might call a quiet life. He had no spouse, no children. His will was written 8 years ago, and in it he named you as the sole beneficiary. Marcus waited. He left you 3 things. Aldrich produced a single sheet of paper. A savings account containing $1,142. He slid the paper across the desk. A storage unit in Carver County containing personal effects. He produced a key on a small metal ring. And he paused here, the practiced pause of someone about to say something they know will land strangely. And the Aldenmore Station. The room was very quiet. I'm sorry, Marcus said.
Aldenmore Station. It's a former rail station in Aldenmore Township, about 62 miles northeast of here. Your uncle purchased it 17 years ago from the Penshire Railway Trust for approximately, he checked his notes, $4,200. Marcus set down the coffee cup very carefully. A train station.
A former train station. It's been decommissioned since 1991. The track lines were formally abandoned by the Railway Authority in 2003. The property sits on approximately 2 acres of land and includes the main station building, a smaller outbuilding that was once used for equipment storage, and a section of original track that runs about 300 meters along the western property line before terminating. Aldred straightened his papers. I have to be candid with you, Mr. Hale, because I think you deserve candor given your situation. The property has been assessed 3 times in the last decade. The most recent assessment valued it at just under $12,000. The structure has significant deterioration. The township has flagged it twice for potential condemnation review. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. So it's worth almost nothing. In its current state, and given the area, yes. The Aldenmore region has experienced significant population decline. There's no active development interest in the area that we've been able to identify. Aldrich folded his hands. I want to be honest with you, because I've been in this profession long enough to know that when people inherit properties in this condition, hope can be a complicated thing. Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at the key on its small metal ring. It was an old-fashioned key, not a modern one, heavy, brass-colored, with a long shaft and a simple bow at the top, the kind of key that belonged to a different era. He picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. Is there anything else? He asked.
Aldrich hesitated. And that hesitation, barely a second, barely the length of a small breath, was the first thing Marcus would think about later when he tried to reconstruct the timeline of how everything changed. There was a letter, Aldrich said, from your uncle. It was to accompany the will. It's unusual. I've been doing estate work for 21 years, and I've read a great many letters left by the deceased. He reached into a folder and produced an envelope, sealed. I haven't opened it. I don't know what's in it, but I'd suggest you read it before you make any decisions about the property. Marcus took the envelope. His name was written on the front in cramped, careful handwriting. Not the handwriting of a man who wrote often, but the handwriting of a man who wrote slowly, deliberately, the way you move when everything you do feels permanent. He did not open it in the lawyer's office. He wasn't sure why. Something about the weight of the key and the weight of the envelope together in his coat pocket felt like a thing that needed to be approached privately, carefully, the way you approach something in the dark whose shape you aren't yet certain of. He took the bus home, back to the shelter, to the narrow bed and the folded blanket, and he sat on the edge of the mattress in the late afternoon quiet with the envelope in his lap. He opened it.
The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on yellow legal paper, and it began with words he hadn't expected. Marcus, if you are reading this, then you have survived something. I don't know what, but the Hale men survive things. It's our one reliable talent. I am sorry I was never part of your life. The falling out between your father and me was my fault. I was young and I was stupid, and I was too proud to repair what I broke. By the time I understood that, it seemed too late. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know how to calculate the debt on something like that. I'm leaving you the station because I can't think of anyone else who would understand it. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking it's worthless. Everyone thinks it's worthless. The railway people told me it was worthless when I bought it. The assessors told me it was worthless. The town council told me it was worthless. The man who tried to buy it from me 6 years ago told me it was worthless. He offered me $150,000 for it. I turned him down. Marcus read that line twice. Then he turned the page, and the next paragraph was shorter, more careful, as if his uncle had paused here, had put down the pen and thought hard about how much to say. There are things in that station that I never told anyone about. Some of it I found, some of it I was told by a very old man who had worked the line since before the Second World War. His name was August Bremer, and he died in 2009. And what he told me, I don't know if it's true, Marcus. I genuinely don't know, but I believe it, and I think you will too once you see what's there. Go to the station. Don't go with anyone else the first time. Go alone. Go slowly.
In the main building, behind the ticket counter, there is a door that doesn't look like it should be there. It was boarded up when I bought the place. I took the boards off. What's behind it? You'll need to decide what to do about it. I couldn't. I ran out of time. Be careful of the man who comes asking, and he will come asking. They always do. I loved you, in the way that men in our family love things they never learned to hold on to. Uncle Lawrence. Marcus sat with the letter for a long time after he finished reading it. Outside, the shelter's common room was filling with the evening crowd. He could hear the buzz of voices, the clatter of dinner trays, the television turned too loud, the ordinary percussion of communal living. He folded the letter along its original creases. He put it back in the envelope. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his coat, next to his chest, where it stayed warm. He did not sleep well that night. The key was on the small table beside his bed, and in the dark of 3 in the morning, when the shelter made its nighttime sounds, he could feel it there, present, waiting.
He took the bus to Aldenmore on a Thursday morning. The route required 2 transfers and took 2 hours and 40 minutes, terminating at a small municipal depot in the township of Carver, from which Aldenmore was another 8 miles. A woman at the depot told him there was no local bus that went out that way, not anymore. There used to be, she said, in the tone people in dying towns use when they talk about things that used to exist, a tone that contains both loss and the strange comfort of having once had something. But the route got cut. He walked. The route out of Carver moved through a landscape that felt like something from a different century, not dramatically so, not the kind of ruin you see in photographs taken to make a point about decline. It was subtler than that. Gas stations with pumps from the 90s, a diner that might have been open or might not, the sign unlit at 11 in the morning, the parking lot holding one truck and an attitude of ambiguity. Fields that had once been farmed and were now occupied by the patient, democratic work of whatever grows when people stop paying attention. Goldenrod, wild sumac, tall brown grasses moving in the November wind. He had his coat zipped to the chin, he had the key in his pocket, he had his uncle's letter, he had the folded directions Aldrich had printed for him. It took an hour and 40 minutes to walk the 8 miles. He smelled the station before he saw it. Not decay exactly, though there was that too, the low woody smell of old timber doing its slow work of returning to earth. What he smelled first was something mineral, something cold and slightly metallic that he would later try to describe and always fail to get exactly right. It smelled, he thought, like time, like a large quantity of accumulated, undisturbed time. Then he came around a bend in the road and through a gap in the tree line, and he saw it. Aldenmore Station. He stopped walking.
It sat at the end of a gravel access road, overgrown to the point of being more suggestion than reality, maybe 300 feet from where he stood. A single-story main building in the craftsman tradition. You could still see it, the bones of it, the wide eaves and the corbelled brackets and the triple window arrangement that would have once been elegant. A low platform running along the side, the remnants of an awning, one end still attached, one end dropped to the ground and partially buried in the undergrowth that had come up through the platform boards. Behind it, to the right, a smaller outbuilding with a corrugated metal roof that had gone orange with rust. And beyond that, cutting through the field at a low grade, the tracks. 2 rails of old steel, grass growing between them, going nowhere in both directions. It looked, Marcus thought, exactly like what the lawyer had described. It looked like nothing. He stood there for a moment with the wind moving across the field and the station sitting in its overgrown stillness, and he tried to locate inside himself the particular feeling he'd been carrying since reading his uncle's letter, that low vibration of something is here, and he found it, still present, quieter now in the face of what he was looking at, but still there, still humming. He started down the gravel road. The closer he got, the more details resolved. Graffiti on the eastern wall, not extensive, not the saturated layering of an urban surface, just a few tags from what looked like years ago, already fading into the wood behind them. Several windows broken, several intact. A padlock on the main door, new or newish, which meant someone had been out here recently to secure it. He checked it against the key from Aldrich. Not a match. He circled the building.
On the south side, near the back corner, there was a smaller door. The kind of service door, lower, narrower than the main entrance. It had a different lock. He tried the key. It turned. The door swung inward with a sound he felt in his teeth. He stood at the threshold for a moment, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The interior of the main hall was larger than the exterior had suggested. These old station buildings often were, the proportions working a kind of quiet architectural deception. The ceiling was high, the original pressed tin still up there, though stained in long brown stripes where the roof had leaked. The floor was wide plank wood, warped in places, solid in others, covered in dust and dead leaves and the small scattered evidence of animal habitation. He could see mouse tracks in the dust without bending down to look. The ticket counter was to his left, a long wooden structure with an arched opening in the middle, the kind you used to pass your money through. Beyond it, the wall of what would once have been the station master's office. And the windows! He hadn't expected the windows. Even broken, even filmed with years of grime, the afternoon light came through them in a way that surprised him. The main hall faced southwest, and the triple window arrangement he'd noticed from outside caught the winter sun at this angle and sent it across the room in long diagonal bars that made the dust motes visible, made the whole space look briefly like something that had been purposefully lit. He stood in the light and didn't move for a while. His architect's eye, which he'd thought was dead or dormant or gone entirely, did something it hadn't done in years. It woke up. It started moving around the room quietly, noting proportions, feeling for what the space had once been and what it might still want to be. He pushed the feeling down. He wasn't here to dream.
He crossed the hall to the ticket counter. The hinged section of the counter was still there, though swollen with damp and requiring real pressure to lift. He went through and into the space behind. And there it was, just as his uncle had described. A door that didn't look like it should be there. It was set into the back wall of the station master's office at an angle that made no immediate architectural sense. Too close to the corner, too narrow, its frame not aligned with the room's geometry. Whoever had built it, and it looked old, the wood dark and settled, the hinges heavy cast iron, had built it to be unobtrusive. Not hidden, exactly, just easy to overlook. Like a sentence in a long document that contains the most important information, but is formatted like everything else around it. The boards his uncle had removed were stacked neatly against the adjacent wall. Lawrence had been here. He'd stood in this spot. He'd taken these boards down one at a time and stacked them carefully, the way a deliberate man approaches an uncertain thing. The door was unlocked. No keyhole on this one. Marcus put his hand on the iron handle. And then, from somewhere in the building, from somewhere close but not immediately localizable, he heard a sound. He went very still. It was a low sound, not mechanical, not the creak of the building settling, though there was that too, a whole background orchestra of wood contracting in the cold. This was something else, rhythmic, almost, and he knew this made no sense, standing here in an abandoned building in a field in the middle of nowhere. Almost like breathing. He waited. 1 second. 3. 10. Silence. He put his hand back on the iron handle and opened the door.
The door opened onto stairs. They went down. He had not expected down. The station, as far as he'd been able to determine, sat on flat ground. There had been no indication from the exterior that there was anything beneath the building. But here were stairs, 8 of them, dropping into a space that was dark enough that he couldn't see the bottom until he pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight. The bottom of the stairs opened into a room. Not a basement in the modern sense, older than that. The walls were stone, rough-cut limestone blocks, dry stacked with the kind of care that suggested someone had been patient and skilled. The ceiling was low, but not uncomfortably so. The floor was packed earth, dry, solid underfoot. The room was perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, and it was, apart from the footprints in the dust, his uncle's, he realized, 2 overlapping sets of the same boot, completely empty. Or almost completely empty. Against the far wall, there was a shelf, rough-hewn timber fixed into the stone with iron brackets. On the shelf, arranged with the deliberateness of someone who expected them to be found, were several items. A tin box, about the size of a shoebox, with a hasp but no padlock. A rolled document, bound with a piece of twine that had gone stiff with age. And a glass bottle, not wine, not spirits, but the kind of square-sided bottle that once held ink, sealed with a cork and containing what appeared to be folded paper. Marcus stood at the foot of the stairs and looked at these things for a long time.
The sound came again, closer now. He spun and swept the flashlight across the room. Nothing. The light ran across stone and dust and the underside of the wooden joists above, and then back to him, illuminating nothing he hadn't already seen. He breathed. He crossed to the shelf.
The tin box first. He opened the hasp and lifted the lid. Inside, laid flat and separated by pieces of tissue paper that had gone brittle, were photographs. Not digital prints. These were actual photographic prints, some of them quite old, black and white, some in early color. He lifted the first one carefully. A train. Not a modern train, a steam locomotive, substantial and beautiful, standing at a platform he recognized immediately despite everything. The same triple windows, the same wide eaves, but new. The station new, the paint fresh, people on the platform in the clothes of the 1940s or thereabouts. He could see a sign, partially obscured by the locomotive's body, but 2 letters visible, A.L., Aldenmore. He looked at the next photograph. A man, 60s perhaps, in a station master's uniform. He was standing at the ticket counter. Marcus could see the arched opening behind him, and he was holding something that caught the light. Marcus tilted the photograph toward his phone's light and leaned in. The man was holding a key. It looked exactly like the one in Marcus's pocket. He put the photograph down. He was not given to dramatic interpretations of coincidence. He had been an architect, trained in the measurable, the verifiable, the built. But standing in this room beneath an abandoned station on a gray November afternoon, with the sound from nowhere still cycling through his memory, with his dead uncle's careful handwriting asking him to go slowly, go alone, he felt something shift inside him that he would not have been able to name without embarrassing himself.
He left the other items on the shelf for the moment. Something in him knew that they needed to be approached in order, that they each had their own information, and that taking them out of sequence would be like reading the last chapter of a book first. He went back up the stairs. The main hall was exactly as he left it. The winter light had shifted in his absence, the diagonal bars now crossing the floor at a steeper angle, the far end of the room darkening toward late afternoon. He had not realized how long he'd been down there. He walked to the south window, intact this one, and looked out at the platform and the field and the tracks beyond. The wind was doing something to the tall grass, rolling it in long waves. He watched it for a while, and then he saw something he hadn't noticed on his way in. At the far end of the platform, where the awning had collapsed and the boards had warped up from the subflooring, there was a mark on the platform's edge. He might have missed it again even now, except that the late light was hitting it at exactly the angle needed to make it visible. A carved mark, cut into the wood of the platform edge, about 3 feet from the platform's terminal point. An arrow, pointing toward the smaller outbuilding. He pulled his coat tighter and went outside.
He didn't make it to the outbuilding that day. He had started across the platform when he heard the car. Not on the access road. That was silent. The sound came from the main road, and a moment later, through the tree line, he saw a vehicle moving at speed along the county road that ran parallel to the property. A dark SUV. It slowed as it passed the access road, slowed noticeably, and then accelerated again and was gone. It might have been nothing. Someone checking an address, someone taking a second look at an unfamiliar turn. But Marcus stood on the platform for a long moment watching the empty tree line, and his uncle's words found him again. Be careful of the man who comes asking, and he will come asking. He did not go to the outbuilding. He noted the carved arrow, he noted the position of the sun, he took photographs with his phone of the main building's exterior, the platform, the tracks, the carving. Then he went back inside, closed the door behind the ticket counter, and went down to the stone room one more time. He took the tin box, the rolled document, and the glass bottle and put them carefully in his canvas bag. He felt, without being able to fully articulate why, that they should not remain here, that they should be with him. He walked back to Carver in the falling dark and took the bus back to the city. He did not sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't restlessness, it was calculation. He lay in the narrow shelter bed with the canvas bag on the floor beside him and turned everything over in his mind, the way you turn a stone over to see what's living under it, patient, deliberate, expecting to be surprised. In the morning, he opened the rolled document.
It was a survey map, hand-drawn, on paper that was aging but still legible. It showed the station property in detail, the buildings, the platform, the track lines, but also the surrounding parcels. The survey was dated 1947.
Someone had annotated it in pencil at a later date, marking certain parcels with small symbols he didn't immediately recognize, X marks, and something that looked like a water droplet. At the bottom, in the same cramped handwriting as his uncle's letter, check the eastern boundary, Rail Trust Deed, 1923. He put the map down. He opened the glass bottle and extracted the folded paper inside. It was a letter, older than Lawrence's letter. The handwriting was precise and old-fashioned, the penmanship of someone educated in a different era, when handwriting was treated as a skill worth mastering. It was dated September 4, 1962, and addressed to the station master, Aldenmore. Dear August, I write this because the lawyers have told me that what I found cannot be addressed in my lifetime. The dispute is too old and too complicated and too embedded in the decisions of men who are now dead. But it should not be forgotten, and someone should know. The eastern boundary of the Aldenmore Station parcel, as defined by the original 1923 charter deed of the Penshire Railway Trust, extends not to the fence line as currently marked, but to the Aldenmore Creek bed, which is another 430 feet east of the existing fence. This was clarified by the State Land Commission in 1931, but never reflected in the county records due to what I can only describe as administrative negligence of a suspicious kind.
What this means, August, is that the parcel, the true parcel, includes something that no one at the railway has apparently seen fit to mention. I have been told I am mistaken. I have been told the records are clear. They are not clear. I have the 1923 charter and the 1931 clarification both, and they are unambiguous. I am leaving copies of both documents for you to keep. Hide them if you must. I don't know who to trust at this point, and neither should you. Yours, Thomas Aldrin. Marcus read the letter twice. He turned it over. The back was blank. He sat for a long time with the letter in his hands, the survey map on his knee, the tin box of photographs open beside him, and the old key on the table, and the sound from the stone room still cycling somewhere in the back of his mind. Eastern boundary, 430 feet east of the existing fence. The water droplets on the map. Something that was not yet fully formed moved through him like a current. He needed to make a call.
He called Denise from the shelter's common room because he had no office, no private space, nowhere else to make the kind of call that requires focus. I need a favor, he said. I need to talk to a lawyer, not Aldridge, someone different, someone who does land and property law. Denise was quiet for a moment. Did something happen? I inherited something. He paused. It might be complicated. He heard her pulling up something on her computer. Denise had a vast informal network. She'd spent 15 years connecting people who had nothing with whatever she could find. There's a legal aid organization on Merchant Street that does property cases. They're underfunded, but they're good. Ask for Priya Nair. He wrote it down. Marcus. Denise's voice had shifted, taken on that careful quality he recognized. What did you inherit? A train station, he said, and possibly something considerably more than a train station. He spent the next 2 days at the public library. He had always known how to research. It was part of what architects did, the deep background work before a design could become real. He approached the station's history the way he had once approached a new project, methodically, from multiple directions, letting the sources talk to each other until a shape emerged.
What he found, assembled piece by piece, was this. The Aldenmore Station had been built in 1921 as part of the Penshire Railway's northeastern expansion. The land had been purchased from a farming family named Aldrin, which explained the letter writer Thomas Aldrin, and the deed, recorded in the State Land Commission's archives and reproduced in a 1931 survey update, had specified the eastern boundary as the center line of Aldenmore Creek. The creek still existed. He found it on a modern county map. It ran through agricultural land, and according to those maps, it ran approximately 400 feet east of the existing station property fence. Those 400 feet of land were currently occupied by a portion of a privately held agricultural parcel whose ownership, after a series of transfers over 7 decades, had arrived at a company called Hartwell Land Acquisitions LLC, registered in Delaware, principal officers not publicly listed. He printed the county ownership records. He stared at the name Hartwell for a long time. Then he searched for it in conjunction with Aldenmore Township. The first result was from the Carver County Gazette, dated 14 months ago. The headline read, "Local officials optimistic about new energy development proposal." He read the article.
Hardwell Land Acquisitions LLC had submitted a preliminary proposal to develop a natural gas compression facility on agricultural land in Aldenmore Township. The facility would serve as a hub for a pipeline expansion currently under review by the State Energy Commission. The proposal had drawn some local opposition, primarily from a small landowners coalition that questioned the environmental impact assessment. He scrolled down. There was a map embedded in the article, a simple diagram showing the proposed facility's footprint. He enlarged it. The proposed facility sat directly adjacent to, in some projections partially overlapping, the eastern boundary of the Aldenmore Station parcel. His hands were very still on the keyboard. He thought about the man who had offered Lawrence Hale $150,000 for the property 6 years ago and had been turned down. He thought about the dark SUV that had slowed on the county road while he stood on the platform. He thought about his uncle's closing line, "Be careful of the man who comes asking, and he will come asking." Then he picked up his phone and called Priya Nair.
Priya Nair's office was 3 rooms above a pharmacy on Merchant Street, and it had the organized chaos of a space that was doing serious work with insufficient resources. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s perhaps, with the particular alertness of someone who has trained herself to miss nothing and who has been underestimated enough times that she stopped being surprised by it. She read the letter from Thomas Aldrin. She read the survey. She looked at his printout of the Hartwell article. She did not say anything for a long time. "Tell me what you found in the stone room," she said finally. "Everything." He told her. "The 1923 charter deed," she said. "Your uncle mentioned it in his letter. The letter from Aldrin says he left copies with the station master. August Bremer, he died in 2009. Right, so either those copies are somewhere, in the station, in someone's estate, in a county archive, or they're gone." She picked up a pen and turned it in her fingers. "Here's what I need you to understand about boundary disputes involving historical deeds. They're nightmarish to litigate under normal circumstances. Property law involving railway trust charters from the 1920s is a particular specialty of obscure, expensive legal horror." She looked at him directly. "But if the 1923 charter and the 1931 commission clarifications say what Aldrin's letter claims they say, and if those documents can be authenticated, then the boundary dispute is real. And if the boundary dispute is real, then part of the land that Hartwell Land Acquisitions is planning to build on may legally belong to you." Silence.
May, she said. Operative word. There are about 17 things that could make this fall apart, but the first step is finding those documents. "The outbuilding," Marcus said. "I didn't get into it. There's a carved arrow on the platform pointing toward it. You need to get in there." "I know. And Marcus," she set down the pen, "once you're in there, once you find anything, you call me before you do anything else. Don't talk to Hartwell. Don't talk to anyone who approaches you about the property. If a man in a nice car comes out to Aldenmore to express interest in your station, you tell me immediately." He told her about the SUV on the county road. Her expression, which had been professionally calibrated throughout the conversation, shifted briefly into something more personal. Not alarmed, but the kind of alert that precedes alarm. "How long ago?" 5 days. She nodded slowly. "You're going back to the station. This weekend. Take someone with you." He thought about it. "I don't." He started to say, "I don't have anyone," which was true in the immediate practical sense. Then he stopped, because the words were harder to say out loud than he'd anticipated. Priya looked at him steadily. "I'll go." He blinked. "I grew up in a small town," she said, in a tone that offered no further explanation and seemed to require none. "I know what abandoned buildings smell like, and I want to see that outbuilding."
They drove out on a Saturday in Priya's car, a 10-year-old Subaru that had logged enough miles to have opinions about it. She brought a camping lantern, a camera, latex gloves, paper evidence bags, and a thermos of coffee. He brought the key and the canvas bag with the items from the stone room, and a particular quality of attention that had been building in him for days. The station looked the same: the field, the overgrown access road, the fallen awning. He had been afraid, somewhere in the peripheral regions of his mind, that it would look different, that the intervening days would have stripped it of the quality he'd felt on his first visit, that quality of latent significance, of something compressed under pressure. It hadn't. If anything, it had intensified. They went inside first. He showed her the stone room, the shelf, the marks in the dust. She crouched and looked and photographed, and did not say much, which he appreciated.
Then they went back out and crossed the platform, careful of the warped boards, and he showed her the carved arrow. She crouched beside it and looked at it for a long time. "This is old," she said. "Yes." "This wasn't your uncle." "No." She stood. "August Bremer." They crossed to the outbuilding. The door was secured with a different padlock than the main building's south entrance. He'd noticed that on his first visit. This one was old, heavy, and more rusted than the newer lock on the main door. He tried the key. It fit. It took effort. The mechanism had seized with disuse, and he had to put real pressure on it, feeling the resistance for a long moment before it gave, the lock snapping open with a sound like a small argument resolved. The door swung on hinges that screamed. Inside. The outbuilding was roughly the size of a two-car garage, and it had once been used for equipment. You could still see the shadows of where large machinery had sat on the floor, the outlines of oil stains, the mounting points on the walls where brackets had been fixed. The roof had fared better than the main buildings, a few holes but not catastrophic, and the dry air that came from having a sealed space for 3 decades had preserved what was inside with an unexpected fidelity. What was inside was file cabinets, 4 of them, old steel, painted green, the kind of institutional furniture that had once occupied every government office in the country. They were lined against the right wall, standing upright, their handles intact. A wooden workbench along the left wall. On the workbench, organized with precision, a series of archival boxes of the kind used for document storage, their lids taped, labels faded but legible. And on the far wall, behind what had once been a partition of some kind, now partially collapsed, a safe. Not a fire safe, a real safe, old, heavy, floor-standing, the kind that required a combination. Priya looked at all of this for a moment. "He knew," she said quietly. "Your uncle knew this was here. This is what he was keeping for 17 years. Marcus crossed to the file cabinets. He pulled the first one open. Full.
Hanging files, labeled in the same hand that had written on the archival boxes above. The labels were faded, but not past reading. Penshire Railway Trust, Correspondence, 1919-1944. Aldenmore Station, Operational Records, 1921-1968. State Land Commission, Survey Records, 1928-1936. He stopped at the third label, State Land Commission, Survey Records, 1928-1936. He pulled the file. Inside, in a hanging sleeve, protected by a mylar sheet that August Bremer had apparently known to use, was a document. 12 pages, typed on a manual typewriter, bearing the letterhead of the Pennsylvania State Land Commission and the date January 14, 1931. He held it with both hands, with the latex gloves on, and read the first page. It was exactly what Thomas Aldrin's letter had described, the 1931 clarification, the determination that the eastern boundary of the Aldenmore Station parcel, as defined by the original 1923 charter deed of the Penshire Railway Trust, extended to the center line of Aldenmore Creek. He looked up at Priya. She was already reading over his shoulder. He watched her read it once, then again, with the focused attention of someone who reads legal documents the way other people read thrillers, for the hidden meaning in the language, for the thing the words are almost but not quite saying. "This is it," she said. Her voice was measured, professional, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, this is the document." "I know. This extends your eastern boundary by approximately 400 feet. I know. That 400 feet goes through the Hartwell parcel."
They stood in the outbuilding, both of them very still, while the implications settled over them like a change in air pressure. Outside, the wind had picked up, running through the dead grass in the field. The steel roof above them ticked with cold. "There's something else," Marcus said. He crossed to the archival boxes on the workbench. He opened the one whose label, though faded, he'd been able to partially read from across the room. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, were more documents, but also, and this was the thing he hadn't been sure he was reading correctly from across the room, something that looked like engineering drawings. He lifted the top sheet carefully. Survey drawings, hand-drawn, the ink still dark, dated 1928. They showed the station parcel and the surrounding land in detail, and in the area east of the fence line, in the area that was either the rightful station parcel or the Hartwell parcel, depending on which century's records you consulted, They showed something marked with a symbol he now recognized. The water droplet symbol from his uncle's annotated survey. Below it, in the engineer's neat notation, spring source, est flow, substantial, quality, tested, potable. Note, unusual mineral composition, further assay recommended. He showed Priya. She looked at it. A spring, she said. A substantial spring, he said, with unusual mineral composition, in 1928, on land that may legally be yours. He set the drawing down on the workbench. He looked at the safe in the corner. What's in there? Priya asked. I don't know the combination.
She walked over and crouched in front of the safe, ran her fingers along the dial, the body, the door. Old, substantial. The kind of thing built to outlast its owner by several generations. Your uncle's letter, she said. Is there anything in it about numbers? He pulled out the letter, read it again, carefully, all 3 pages, then stopped. Near the end of the second page, a sentence he'd read as atmospheric, as the kind of thing a solitary old man writes when he's writing his last words. I have thought a great deal about August in these last years. He was precise in everything he did. He once told me that the only things worth keeping are the things you can say with a number. Marcus looked at the safe. The things you can say with a number. He crossed to the safe and crouched beside it. He tried the station's founding year, 1921, left, right, left. Nothing. He tried 1931, the Land Commission clarification. Nothing. He tried August Bremer's birth year. He'd found a brief obituary at the library, 1904. The dial moved, the tumblers engaged. He looked at Priya. She was very still. He pulled the handle. The safe opened.
Inside the safe, a deed, the original deed. The 1923 Penshire Railway Trust Charter deed for the Aldenmore Station parcel, on paper thick enough to have survived a century without significant deterioration, with the state seal still visible, and the boundary description, to the center line of Aldenmore Creek, written out in the precise formal language of 1923. 2 letters from the State Land Commission, originals, dated 1931, signed by the Commission's director. A sealed report from a geological survey company, dated 1929. He could read the letterhead, Pennsylvania Mineral Survey Associates. The seal in the report was still intact, wax impressed with an institutional stamp, never opened. A set of photographs, old, black and white, 8 of them, showing the area east of the station, the land beyond what was now the fence line, and in several of them, something that was clearly a natural spring. The unmistakable shallow depression, the wet ground, the careful measuring equipment of 1929 arranged around it. And underneath all of this, flat at the bottom of the safe, a handwritten note. Not from Lawrence, not from August Bremer. The handwriting matched the letter he'd found in the glass bottle. Thomas Aldrin, the original landowner's son, the man who'd sold the land to the railway, and then, by 1962, had discovered something he couldn't live long enough to correct. The note said, to whoever finds this, the spring is real, the boundary is real. What I had the water tested for in 1929 is in the sealed report. I was told then that the concentrations were too low to be commercially significant. Technology changes. What is insignificant in 1929 may not be insignificant forever. The railway bought this land partly for this reason. They knew. They chose not to develop it and chose not to disclose it to us when we sold. I cannot prove bad faith at this distance of time. But if the technology ever catches up, if what's in the ground here ever becomes significant, someone should know that this land was taken under terms that were not entirely honest. Find what's in the report. Then decide what justice looks like.
T. Aldrin, 1963. Marcus sat back on his heels on the outbuilding floor and looked at the sealed report in his hands. Priya crouched beside him. Don't open it, she said quietly. Not here. We need to document everything in C2 first. We need a chain of custody. He nodded. He could feel his pulse in places he wasn't normally aware of his pulse. Priya, he said. Yes? What's in natural springs with unusual mineral compositions that become significant when technology improves? She was quiet for a moment. A lot of things, she said carefully. Lithium, rare earth elements. She paused. It could be nothing.
It could be water with an unusually high iron content. It could be. Or, she said, it could be something that someone building a natural gas compression facility on adjacent land would very much prefer not to have discovered by the rightful owner of that adjacent land. The wind moved over the outbuilding roof like a conversation they weren't meant to hear.
He came on a Monday. Marcus had returned to the station twice more in the intervening week, each time with Priya, documenting everything, building the case file with the meticulous attention of someone who knows that the difference between winning and losing is often the difference between organized and sloppy. Priya had brought in a colleague, an older lawyer named Franklin, who specialized in historical land rights and who, after an afternoon reviewing the documents, had used the word actionable 3 times in a row, which Priya later told Marcus was approximately 3 times more than Franklin typically used that word. The sealed geological report had been opened in Priya's office, in the presence of both lawyers and a notary. The spring on the eastern Aldenmore parcel, the parcel that the 1923 deed and 1931 commission clarification identified as part of the station property, contained measurable concentrations of lithium carbonate. The 1929 report had assessed the concentration as commercially insignificant by the standards of that era. By the standards of 2024, with the global lithium market having expanded by several thousand% in response to the electric vehicle and energy storage industries, the assessment was considerably different. Franklin had not been theatrical about this. He had simply read the relevant section aloud, set the report down, and said, "We need a current geological assessment, and we need to file a boundary claim before anyone else files anything about this land." They were 3 days into that process when the man came. Marcus was at the station alone. He'd come to photograph the track line's eastern terminus, per Franklin's request. The track, he'd explained, might be relevant to establishing historical occupation of the boundary area. He was on the platform with his phone, photographing the track's convergence point with the boundary fence line, when he heard the car on the access road. Not a dark SUV this time, a black sedan, clean, quiet, expensive.
A man got out, 60s, the kind of physical presence that money and confidence assemble over decades, not imposing through size, but through the absolute absence of uncertainty. He was in a coat that probably cost more than the original purchase price of the station. He walked up the access road with the easy stride of someone who has never been required to hurry. He smiled at Marcus. The smile had the quality of a business tool. "Mr. Hale, I'm glad I caught you." His voice was warm, in the way that professional warmth is warm, deployed with precision. "My name is Jeffrey Hartwell." Marcus looked at him. He said nothing. Hartwell glanced around at the station with an expression that managed to be simultaneously dismissive and covetous, the expression of a man looking at something he wants while maintaining the posture of a man who doesn't need it. "This is quite a property," Hartwell said. "I was sorry to hear about Lawrence. He was stubborn about this place, but I had a certain respect for that. Stubbornness has its own kind of integrity." He turned back to Marcus. "I'd like to make you an offer, a serious offer. Better than the one I made your uncle." "I know about the one you made my uncle," Marcus said. Something shifted in Hartwell's expression, just for a moment, just long enough. "Then you know it was generous," Hartwell said, recovering the warm smile. He said no. He did. People sometimes make decisions that are, he chose the word carefully, sentimental. "What's your offer?" $225,000. He said it with the matter-of-factness of someone naming a price on a commodity. For the station, the outbuildings, and the full parcel as recorded in current county records. "I can have the paperwork drawn up within the week. There would be no complications, no delays. You'd have a bank transfer within 10 days of signing." Marcus looked at him.
$225,000. He thought about the shelter on Birchwood Avenue. He thought about the buzzer at 5:45. He thought about the eggs the color of old paper, and the foreman who looked through him on the sidewalk, and the 12-year-old boy who'd looked at him across the street with the unfiltered recognition of the young. He thought about Claire, about the 30 miles that might as well be an ocean. He thought about what Franklin had said 3 days ago, his voice professionally careful, but his eyes doing something different. If the boundary claim holds and the geological assessment supports the historical survey, and I believe it will, you're not talking about the value of the station. You're talking about the value of a significant lithium deposit on land you may legally own. That number is considerably more complicated to calculate. I'll think about it, Marcus said. Hartwell held the smile. Don't think too long. Development timelines don't wait, and once things get complicated... He left the rest of the sentence unfinished in a way that was carefully engineered to feel like a warning. Thank you for coming, Marcus said. After the sedan was gone, Marcus stood alone on the platform for a long time. The wind moved through the field. The tracks caught the afternoon light. The station sat behind him, enormous and quiet, and full of everything that was still waiting to be decided. He called Priya. He was here, he said. We expected that, she said. Are you all right? He looked at the field, at the eastern fence line, at the land beyond it that was either his or wasn't, depending on what a court would say about documents kept in a safe by an old station master who had believed for 40 years that someone would eventually come and know what to do with them. I'm fine, he said. File the claim.
The months that followed were not simple. Nothing about the Alden Moore boundary dispute was simple. Franklin had been right about that from the beginning. The case was a tangle of historical documents, expired regulatory jurisdictions, corporate ownership chains designed to obscure, and the particular institutional friction that accumulates when powerful interests want something to not be true. Hartwell Land Acquisitions did not accept the boundary claim quietly. They retained a firm from Philadelphia, expensive, established, aggressive. Their initial response questioned the authenticity of the 1931 Land Commission documents. Their second response questioned the chain of custody. Their third response raised an argument about adverse possession, suggesting that decades of uncontested occupation of the boundary land had extinguished any historical claim. Priya worked 18-hour days for 6 weeks. Franklin called in a historical property specialist from Temple University whose specialty was exactly this kind of early-century railway charter dispute. The geological assessment came back from the firm they'd hired, a current state-licensed survey, and its conclusions aligned almost exactly with the 1929 survey's findings. Lithium carbonate, present in concentrations that by current extraction standards were commercially significant. The numbers that started to appear in Franklin's careful projections were not the numbers of a man who had inherited a worthless train station. Marcus worked too. He was not a lawyer, but he had been an architect, and architects are fundamentally people who understand how pieces fit together. He organized documents, he built timelines, he cross-referenced the photographic record from the tin box with satellite maps of the current property boundary. He spent 3 Saturdays in the county records office, reading deed transfers going back to 1921, and what he found there, the deliberate, slow-motion erasure of the original boundary specification from successive county records, each transfer quietly dropping the creek line description and substituting the fence line, was the thing that gave Franklin his clearest argument. This wasn't negligence, Franklin said, laying out the sequence of record alterations on his desk. The 1931 Commission clarification was known. It was suppressed, gradually, across multiple bureaucratic transactions. Someone, over several decades, made sure it disappeared from the public record. Can you prove that? Priya asked. I can show a pattern, he said. A court can decide what a pattern means.
But the case moved slowly, as legal cases do, and Marcus's money, the $1,100 from his uncle's account, ran out in January. He went back to the shelter. He went back to the labor corner. He went back to the gray eggs and the 5:45 buzzer. But something was different now. The quality of the waiting was different. He was not waiting for nothing. He was waiting for something specific, and the specificity made it bearable in a way that mere hoping never had been. Priya's legal aid organization was doing the work pro bono. She told him this matter-of-factly, as though it were not an enormous gift. Why? He asked her once. She gave him a look that said she considered the question slightly impertinent. Because the work matters, she said, and because the Aldrin family sold that land in 1921 under terms that were not honest, and because your uncle spent 17 years being a custodian of something he couldn't fix himself, and because, she paused, because you came in here with a tin box and a glass bottle and a key, and you didn't ask for a handout, you asked for help understanding what was yours. She turned back to her documents. That's actually fairly rare. In February, something happened he hadn't prepared for. Claire called. He almost didn't answer because he didn't recognize the number, and she changed her number twice in 4 years.
When he heard her voice, he was in the shelter's common room, and he walked outside into the cold and stood on the sidewalk with the phone pressed to his ear and didn't say anything for a moment because the voice reached into him and rearranged something. "Dad," she said, "someone told me you inherited something, a station. How did you hear? It's in the county court filings. They're public record. Your name is in there." A pause. "I looked you up." He was quiet. "Is it real?" she asked, "what they're saying about the land?" "It might be," he said. "We don't know yet." Another pause, long enough that he thought she might hang up. "Dad," she said, She stopped, started again. "Can I see you?" He stood in the February cold with his eyes closed. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Claire."
He had found, in his 53rd year, after losing everything that could be lost and carrying everything that could be carried, a building full of buried things, a dead uncle's last trust, an old station master's 60 years of faithful keeping, a landowner's 40-year attempt at justice, a spring that had been moving through the ground since before any of them were born, carrying whatever it carried, patient in the absolute way that water is patient, certain in the absolute way that water is certain. And he had found something in himself that he thought was gone. Not fortune, not luck, not the simple reversal of circumstances that makes for a satisfying story where everything is fixed by a final act. Something harder to name. The capacity to receive, the willingness to accept that the thing you were meant to be a custodian of might arrive late and look like nothing and require everything you have, and that this is still better than arriving nowhere and being nothing's custodian. He had been a man who had stopped believing he deserved anything. He had learned in a ruined station on a back road in a dying township that what you deserve and what you're given are two separate questions, and that sometimes what you're given is not for you alone. It's for the work that you, specifically, with your specific set of losses and skills and patient waiting, are the right person to do. He heard footsteps above him, the crew arriving. He heard Claire's voice. She'd started coming to help on weekends, and her voice had the quality in this building that all voices had in spaces with good acoustics, fuller, more present, carrying the shape of the person it belonged to. He heard the building breathing around him, the way old buildings breathe when they become occupied again, a barely perceptible shift, the timbers taking on the warmth of human presence, the space adjusting to the fact of being used. He put his hand on the stone wall, cold, solid, patient. He went up the stairs. He went to work.
The boundary claim hearing was scheduled for April. Not a full trial, a preliminary hearing before a circuit judge to determine whether the historical boundary dispute had sufficient merit to proceed. If the judge found merit, the case would advance. If not, it ended there. In the weeks before the hearing, 3 things happened. First, the geological assessment firm returned with supplementary findings, having been asked to quantify the surface area of the deposit relative to the disputed parcel. Their conclusion was that the mineral-rich spring zone extended across approximately 80% of the disputed 400-foot strip. The lithium carbonate concentrations, while requiring extraction infrastructure to commercialize, were in the range that comparable deposits in the American West had attracted acquisition interest in the tens of millions of dollars. Franklin read this report with the stillness of a man restraining a very large reaction. Second, a journalist from a regional news outlet contacted Priya about the case. She'd been covering Hartwell's pipeline development proposal, which had become locally contentious due to environmental concerns raised by the landowners' coalition. When she learned that the boundary dispute involved a potential lithium deposit on land Hartwell was planning to build on, she wrote a piece that ran on a Wednesday. By Thursday, it had been picked up by a state-level outlet. By Friday, a national environmental news organization had filed its own inquiry with the State Land Commission, asking why the 1931 boundary clarification had not been reflected in county records. Hartwell's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter. Priya filed it in a drawer with great satisfaction. Third, an old woman named Miriam Bremer contacted Priya's office. She was August Bremer's niece. She had read the news article. She had in her attic a box of her great-uncle August's personal papers that she'd never fully gone through because she'd assumed they were train records and had no idea what to do with them. Would anyone like to look at them? They drove to her house in a suburb of Carver on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus, Priya, Franklin. They sat at Miriam Bremer's kitchen table while she brought out a cardboard box, apologizing for the dust, offering coffee, having the quality of a person who has lived long enough to know that the things you take for granted are sometimes the things that matter most. Inside the box, August Bremer's diary,
50 years of it. A man who had worked the Aldenmore line since 1929, who had been the last station master when the station closed in 1991, who had kept meticulous notes on everything he observed. They opened it to 1963, the year of Thomas Aldrin's letter. August's entry for September 12, 1963. Aldrin came again. He is a worried man, getting old now, his family gone from this area. He brought me the papers I already have copies of, and some I didn't, letters from the commission, the original deed. He also brought me the geological report, sealed, and asked me to keep it. He said, "If anyone ever asks, the spring is real. Don't let them tell you it isn't." I told him I knew it was real. I've drunk from it many times. The water has a taste unlike anything else. Good water. Whatever's in it, good or bad, it's good water. I put everything in the safe. Lawrence Hale helped me move it out here in the winter of 1987. He was a young man then. He understood why it needed to be kept. He was always a man who understood the weight of things. Priya looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the diary. Lawrence had been 26 in 1987. He'd just left the family. He'd come to Aldenmore and helped an old station master move a safe full of historical documents into a storage building, and then he'd spent the next 34 years being the custodian of a secret he couldn't fully act on until he ran out of time and left everything to the nephew he'd never met. Marcus closed the diary carefully. "Miriam," he said, "would you be willing to bring this to court?" She was 81 years old. She looked at the diary, and then at Marcus, and then at the kitchen where she'd lived her whole adult life. "My great-uncle August worked that station for 62 years, she said. "He believed in doing things right. If it would honor that," she straightened in her chair. "Yes, I'll bring it to court."
The hearing was on an April morning. Cold still. Winter not yet finished. The courtroom was small. Circuit court, not a dramatic stage. Judge Patricia Wren, 60, with the measured patience of someone who has spent 30 years watching human beings argue about ownership and has not lost the capacity to find it interesting. Hartwell's lawyers were good. They were very good. They made the argument about adverse possession with clarity and force. They challenged the chain of custody on the 1931 documents. They questioned the reliability of August Bremer's diary as a legal record. They were professional, persuasive, and expensive. Priya was better. She was better not because she was louder or more theatrical, but because she had done the work that the other side had assumed would not get done. She had found every document. She had traced every suppression of the 1931 clarification through the county records. She had found in the State Land Commission's own archives, the originals, not copies, the full record of the 1931 boundary determination, cross-filed under a case number that had never been properly indexed and had therefore survived decades of selective record management. She put Miriam Bremer on the stand. Miriam read a passage from August's diary. Her voice was steady. She put Marcus on the stand. He answered quietly, without performance, with the particular precision of a man who has spent months learning to see a complicated thing clearly. And she presented the photographic record. The photographs from the tin box, the 1929 Geological Survey photographs, and this was the detail that Hartwell's lawyers had not prepared for. A set of aerial photographs she'd obtained from the State Historical Archives, taken in 1947, clearly showing the station's eastern boundary extending to a water feature that was, by geographic reference points, the Aldenmore Creek. Judge Wren asked several questions. She listened to the answers. She took a recess.
She came back and said, "The court finds sufficient evidence to support the plaintiff's claim that the original 1923 Penshire Railway Trust Deed Charter established the eastern boundary of the Aldenmore Station parcel at the center line of Aldenmore Creek, and that the 1931 State Land Commission clarification formally codified this boundary. The subsequent county record discrepancies do not extinguish this historical claim. This matter will proceed to full adjudication." She looked at both tables. "I also want to note," she said, "that the pattern of documentation this court has been shown raises questions that may warrant inquiry beyond the scope of this proceeding. I'll be referring certain materials to the State Attorney General's office." Hartwell's lead attorney made a motion to the papers in front of him. Priya looked at Marcus. She didn't smile. She was too careful for that, too professional, too well acquainted with the distance between preliminary victories and final ones. But something in her eyes acknowledged the moment. Marcus nodded. It wasn't over. It would not be over for some time. The full adjudication would take months, perhaps over a year.
Hartwell would not surrender easily, and their resources were vast, and the law was slow, and the world had a way of complicating the simplest narratives. But the claim was real, the boundary was real, the spring was real, and he was no longer invisible.
There is a particular quality to the moment when a thing shifts from potential to actual. It doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a specific morning, a specific light, a specific smell on the air that your body recognizes before your mind does. Marcus recognized it the morning he drove back to Aldenmore Station, his station, for the first time in a car of his own. It was a used car, purchased 2 months after the hearing, when enough had been settled in the legal process to allow for an advance against the dispute's projected outcome, and when he'd finally accepted the temporary housing assistance Denise had been trying to arrange for months. He had a small apartment. His name was on the lease. The lease existed in the world. The key to his apartment was on the same key ring as the old brass key from Robert Aldridge's desk. He parked at the end of the access road and sat in the car for a moment. He was thinking about Claire. They had been meeting for dinners, once a month, then twice a month. Careful at first, the way you were careful with something that was once broken and has been mended, but whose structural integrity you're still learning to trust. She was 31 now, a teacher. She had her mother's patience and his attention to detail, and she'd been carrying the weight of their estrangement as heavily as he had, which he hadn't fully understood until she told him so directly at a dinner in March. "I thought you'd given up on us," she said. "On me." "I never gave up on you," he said. "I gave up on myself, for a while." She looked at him. What changed?
"I found something that needed to be taken care of," he said. "Something someone else had kept for me. And I realized—" He stopped, tried to find the honest version of it. "I realized that you can only really receive something if you've stopped telling yourself you're the kind of person who doesn't deserve to receive it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and said, "Tell me about the station." He got out of the car now and walked down the access road. The overgrowth had been cleared. He'd done some of it himself, hired local young men from Carver for the rest. The platform was visible. The awning had been partially secured. The main door was open, standing wide in the morning light. Inside, the station was exactly what it had always been, and also, subtly, completely different. The pressed tin ceiling had been cleaned. The windows had been washed, inside and out, and the light they admitted was not the grimy half-light of an abandoned space, but something closer to what the original architect had intended, which was, he'd come to understand, quite a lot. The wide plank floor had been swept, and he'd begun the careful process of assessing which boards needed replacement and which were sound. The ticket counter was solid. The arched opening was intact. An architect's eye is not a thing that dies. He'd been afraid it had. He'd been wrong. He stood in the main hall and turned slowly, and he saw it. Not what it was, not exactly what it had been, but what it might become. The place had bones. Extraordinary bones. The proportions were right. The light was right. The material relationship between the stone foundation and the timber structure and the pressed tin ceiling was right, in the way that buildings from this era were often right. Not by calculation, but by the slower and more reliable intelligence of people who built with their hands and their eyes, and their understanding of the materials. The legal process was still ongoing. The full adjudication would take time, but Hartwell's lawyers had, in January, opened a settlement discussion, quietly, through intermediaries, with the careful face-saving language of people who have concluded that the alternative to settling is worse. The numbers under discussion were not the numbers of a worthless train station. They were the numbers of a contested mineral deposit on approximately 6 acres of land that a natural gas compression facility had been planning to build on, and whose absence from the development plan would cost Hartwell considerably more than the cost of making the dispute go away.
Franklin had told him very carefully what the range of the settlement might look like. Marcus had listened. He had not reacted. He had sat with it for a week. Then he'd called Priya and asked her to come to the station. She'd stood in the main hall in her practical coat, looking around with the same alert, missing-nothing attention she brought to everything. "What do you see?" he asked. She turned slowly. "Bones," she said. "Good ones. I want to restore it." She looked at him. "Not just restore," he said. "I want to make it into something. A community space, a center, something the township can actually use." He walked toward the triple windows. "There's nothing out here anymore. The town died slowly when the railroad left.
But the land is still here. The building is still here. If the settlement goes through, if there's capital, there will be capital, Priya said carefully, if we're patient. I've had practice being patient. She was quiet for a moment. What kind of center? I don't know yet exactly. Housing resources, job training, maybe a makerspace. There's light industry in Carver if you could train people for it. A library. He stopped. Thought of the library in West Virginia, the skylights, the children looking up. Definitely a library. Priya looked at him for a long time. You're serious? I'm an architect, he said. I haven't been one for a while, but I am one. Something moved in her expression. Not pity, something considerably more respectful than pity. The look of someone who has watched a person locate themselves. You'll need an architectural license review, she said practically. I know, I've already started the paperwork. You'll need a board of directors for a nonprofit structure. I was hoping you'd consider being on it. She looked around the hall again. At the pressed tin ceiling and the wide plank floor, and the triple windows admitting the April light in long bars that fell across the room like a plan being laid out. Send me the paperwork, she said.
He went back to the stone room one more time before the restoration began. He went alone in the early morning before the crews arrived. He took the stairs carefully. They were on the list to be addressed. And he stood in the low stone space with the limestone walls and the packed earth floor and the empty shelf where the tin box and the rolled document and the glass bottle had waited for him. He stood there for a long time. He was listening. The sound came, softer than he remembered, or perhaps he'd simply learned how to hear it properly. Low, rhythmic. Not breathing, he understood it now, had understood it for months, though he'd been slow to accept what he was hearing. Water. Moving water, somewhere beneath the packed earth floor, moving as it had moved for however many centuries it had been moving, through the mineral-rich ground on the eastern edge of what was now, formally, contested to be his property. The spring, which was not actually a spring in the sense of a surface feature, it ran below ground before it surfaced in the boundary area, but it ran close enough to the surface here, in this old stone room, that you could hear it if you were quiet enough, if the building above you was quiet enough, if you'd cleared enough of your own interior noise to listen. August Bremer had heard it. He had drunk from the surface expression of it and called it good water. Thomas Aldrin had known about it and spent 40 years trying to ensure someone else would know. Lawrence Hale had spent 17 years keeping the knowledge safe, running out of time before he could do anything more with it. And Marcus had stood here in November, alone, not knowing what he was hearing, and the sound had reached him anyway. He thought about something his mother had told him once, when he was young, and they lived in a better time, and she had the habit of finding the essential thing in complicated situations and naming it cleanly. What's buried doesn't stay buried, she'd said. It just waits for the right kind of patience.